talking about Custer's Last Stand. The anniversary of that, believe it or not, is this weekend. We'll talk about it with Dennis Koller. He's coming up on It's Your Turn on WISR right after these words. Fascinated by history, listeners? Well, I think we have a good story coming up for you next on the It's Your Turn program here on WISR. If you're just joining us, my name is Dave Malarkey. We speak with author Dennis Koller, who joins us by telephone today, and we're going to be talking about a book that he's just written. It's a mystery, a thriller, and it's about Custer's Last Stand. First of all, Dennis Koller, nice to meet you. Nice to be able to talk with you for a few minutes here today.
Dave, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
This is a story that I can't imagine that there's anybody that hasn't at least heard of Custer's Last Stand, that's for sure. What's the full title of your book, Dennis?
My book is called The Custer Conspiracy, and it is about the battle. It's about a lot of things, but I use the Battle of the Little Bighorn as a kind of a foil for a much kind of larger view of the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, we will point out for listeners, although we're going to be talking about a lot of history here, your book is a novel, right? It's fiction.
It is a novel. It's fiction, you bet.
Could we categorize it as historical fiction? In other words, is a lot of what you write about actually true, and then you're just kind of adding to it?
You know, it depends on the genre. You know, mm-hmm. There's historical fiction that takes place actually at the time. There's one I'm thinking of that. It's called Guns of the South. I read it years and years ago, and it's where people go back from our age, goes back into the Civil War. They arm the South with AK-47s, and the war is over in 3 weeks. And so then General Lee becomes the president, and so on. But it stays back in that time. But my book doesn't. My book has it starts out in the present. It's about a secret that. Like the Da Vinci Code, it's a lot like that in that respect. It's
yes.
Secret held by a family for the past 141 years, and it's a secret that if divulged would or could cause, in my imagination and in the book, a rewrite of the past century and a half of world history.
Well, let me, if I dare, take a sentence or two here to try to summarize for our listeners what your book's about and what we're going to talk about here. It was late June in 1876 that an overconfident Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was killed, along with many of his men from the 7th Calgary, at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Or was he? Question mark. Now here's the intrigue. So you are suggesting that perhaps Custer was not killed at Little Bighorn?
That's what I was suggesting,
mm-hmm.
and in the book, that's exactly what happens. It's and the book unfolds as the secret. Mm-hmm. The secret in modern times, just like 2 weeks ago, would have been revealed, or a history professor found out that about the secret, and the secret is that. Custer lived, but you don't know that in the beginning of the story, and the professor gets before he can put this out into into the world, the secret, he gets killed, gets murdered, and so the book then becomes essentially a murder mystery. Why did this professor get killed, and who? They know he was working on something about Custer, mm-hmm. but the homicide inspector, who is a friend of the professor's, wants to know, who would kill somebody, or, it happened 141 years ago. Custer or no Custer, who the heck even care in our day? So what the connection is that there's something that has been carried over from the time that the Battle of Little Bighorn, that is, that has relevance today, and that's what the story's about.
It has been a deeply buried and closely guarded
It
secret.
has, and you know, it just this is a kind of a footnote, but 2017 lines up perfectly in terms of dates and days with the dates and days of 1876. So 141 years ago on this Friday, June 23rd, 1876, you know, George Custer is 2 days away from meeting his so-called fate.
Wow.
At the Bighorn, and you know, he's riding his 7th Cavalry is riding down the Rosebud Creek at this very time, and he makes camp, and he's not supposed to go. I mean, just historically, he's not supposed to go there. He's been told to keep on going south, and they know now where the Indians are, but he was supposed to continue south, come around in back of them, come up the Little Bighorn Valley, and where they were going to have another cavalry column, or actually infantry column, coming down from the north to catch them in a kind of an anvil. But Custer gets glory hounded and goes in himself, and then gets decimated. So.
Just to give you a little, and folks, don't worry if you like a good mystery thriller, and I do. I love them. We're not going to spill the beans here, but just a little bit of a setup. Matt Conroy is the name that our guest, author Dennis Koller, has selected for the modern-day history professor, who indeed discovers this long-buried secret about Custer. He calls an old friend of his who just happens to be San Francisco homicide inspector Tom McGuire. Hey, there's a familiar name because you've written about him in a couple of other books, haven't you, Dennis?
I have, yeah. This is my 3rd book, and I'm writing a 4th, and I've carried the character Tom McGuire through all 3 of them. Yeah. So he's to my readers, he's a well-known personage.
So, and again, Dennis already mentioned this, and this is just a setup at the beginning, really. They agree, the two of them agree to meet at the National Battlefield Monument at the Little Bighorn, but when McGuire gets there, as Dennis said, he finds that his friend, the professor, the history professor, is already dead, and here goes the murder mystery. It's a great setup, but very, very, very intriguing. First of all, a little bit about, and I'm sure that you've done a great deal of historical research as background for this novel, Dennis Koller, but some of our listeners may need a little bit of a primer, and I had to look some stuff up myself, quite frankly. First of all, the Little Bighorn, it's a river, actually, right? Yeah.
It is a river, correct?
In
Montana.
What's now Montana at the time, in the 1870s, it wasn't a state yet, it was a Montana territory. And I need some help on this because I seem to have read this somewhere. Maybe I saw it in a film or something. Was Custer big-headed? Was he an egomaniac? Was he pretty full of himself?
Yes. You know, the Custer's had, I think, takes a bad rap. I've been a kind of a Custer-phile my whole life, and I read a lot of history, and he's always intrigued me, as he has many people, because of the kind of contradictions that were inside of him. He was, you know, the worst cadet ever to graduate from the military academy. He had more demerits than anybody, and still more demerits than anybody who ever got out of there. And he would have never gotten out of there had not the Civil War had already started, and they needed officers. But he gets out, and he turns out to be a pretty good soldier, and he's in the cavalry, and he does great deeds in the Civil War. He was a real hero in the Civil War. In fact, some people consider the Battle of Gettysburg was won because Custer kind of kept Jeb Stuart's cavalry, the Southern cavalry, away from the battlefield by doing this screen and so on and so forth, and that opened the door for, you know, the Union Army to come and actually win that fight. So that's who he was. He was braggadocio. He was kind of a jerk, I think you'd say in modern times. But he was a good soldier and a good general. And so that he went into the Little Bighorn and got everybody under his command killed. People say, well, he shouldn't have done it, but the fact of the matter is, in the Little Bighorn, what happened in the Little Bighorn was that he was just outmanned and outgunned, and he didn't know it going in, There was the view of Indians in the military in those years was that they were great guerrilla fighters, but they wouldn't, and they were. I mean, they would snipe at you, come around, they had their ponies were real quick, but they would never stand and fight you, and that was Custer's experience in the Indian Wars. And so he goes in with, about 600 troops and, kind of splits them up and everybody kind of faults him for that. But he did exactly what the Times said he should do. He's going to use part of his troops to go and push the Indians in the valley up towards him. He's going to go north. He wants to push them from the south, from the south. But the Indians foil him because they decide to stand and fight. And it was really the first time. And they were well armed. I mean, so in his battle, he had 210 troopers, all of whom died, and himself 211. They were against estimates from 3,000 to 5,000 Indians, and a lot of them had repeaters. That the government had given them. Custer's troops had single-shot weapons. And that battle lasted about 35 minutes. They just rolled over him. And it really wasn't his... I mean, there was nothing he could have done. I mean, that's just the way it was.
A little bit of historical back... Oh, folks, I'll tell you what. I have a few more minutes. I'm able to talk with Dennis, but I need to take a quick break here. So let's do that. We'll pick up our conversation with author Dennis Koller, author of the Custer Conspiracy. Back in just a couple of minutes with more. We are speaking today with physical medicine and rehabilitation specialist Dr. Edward Reedy from Tri-Rivers Surgical. Dr. Reedy, what causes back pain?
The causes of back pain are numerous, and in younger people tend to involve soft tissue problems such as muscles, tendons, or ligaments, and as we age a bit, tend to involve wear and tear and deterioration of the discs of the low back. Patients have at their own disposal the best treatment for low back pain, which is fitness. They can keep their weight down and do a fair amount of core strengthening exercises such as abdominal strengthening, back muscle strengthening, and lower extremity muscle strengthening. That should help them minimize their back pain and also avoid injuries. Someone with chronic back pain should seek consultation with a physician if their symptoms last greater than a month or if they experience any leg pain associated with the back pain.
To learn more, call Tri-Rivers Surgical at their new office near the Clearview Mall in Butler. Toll free 866-874-7483.
Who can you trust to do it right, respectfully? When it comes to pet cremation, a respected name in Butler provides impeccable service. Butler Pet Cremation and Glenn Thompson Miller offer a sensitive, caring service for that sensitive time. And here's what we pledge. Your pet will be cremated individually in our impeccable facility here in Butler. We assure you that the cremains are assuredly your pets and your pets alone. But before you make your decision, ask how other facilities perform. Individual cremation? It's an important and sensitive question. Bring your pet to us or we'll go to your home. We promise dignity and loving care. When the time comes, tell your veterinarian that you prefer Butler Pet Cremation and Glenn Thompson Miller. He's a pet parent too. Call us at 724-287-3707 or contact us at www.butlerpetcremation.com.
You're listening to It's Your Turn here on WISR. My name is Dave Malarkey. Our guest visiting with us by telephone today is author Dennis Koller. We're talking about his latest book, The Custer Conspiracy. It's actually the third in the Tom McGuire mystery thriller series. So the reason that the U.S. cavalry was going after the Indians, this is all part of the Sioux Wars, right? This
Correct.
is post-Civil War, and quite frankly, it's not a very, from a philosophical standpoint, it doesn't paint a very pretty picture of the American government, because we just kept pushing the Native American Indians further and further out of their territories until they finally said enough is enough, and they started fighting back. But isn't that the overall picture of why American troops
no,
were there in the first place?
that's essentially what happened. The catalyst for all this was and it's kind of strange that Custer was involved in the catalyst too, is that in the Treaty of 1868, I believe, the Fort Laramie Treaty, President Grant deeded the Dakota Territory, so that was both North and South, and the Black Hills, to the Sioux Nation, the Lakota Sioux, and in perpetuity. And no white man was ever supposed to go in there. Well, the one breach in the not breach, but the one consideration of the treaty was that the Army could put a fort inside the Black Hills. So in 1874, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, this huge troop of cavalry go into the Black Hills to looking for a fort, and they discover gold. And you know, at the time, the country was falling apart. They had almost bankrupted themselves with the Civil War, and they had crisis after crisis, economic crisis. Well, this was going to save them, and you know, it was the biggest gold find, way bigger than California's, and in the history of the country. So miners started flowing in. Well, the Indians are now not very happy about that, and the truth is that President Grant tells them, you know, they have to get on reservations, and they're going to take the Black Hills back, and let's renegotiate. And the Indians say no, and he starts what's essentially an illegal war against them, and so that's how I started this story. I wanted to know who benefited from Custer's death. Who benefited? And all you had to do is look at what happened to the Indians after that, you know, after the Battle of Little Bighorn. Let's say Custer gets away, or he dies. And finally, it doesn't make any difference. What happened after that was June 25th, 1876 was 9 days away from the centennial of the country's birth. And everybody on the East Coast, they were building, you know, there were going to be speeches, and they'd had to regale you up, and they were building stands for all the politicians to come and talk. June 25th, Custer gets wiped out. July 5th, the nation learns that Custer has been wiped out. And the outcry is so immense that the people demand that the government rearm, get the army much bigger, and go get those guys. And that's exactly what they did. And 5 years later, there were no Plains Indians. They were all on reservations or dead. And that's just the sad story. Wow. And in the nation, who you know, when you say, so who benefited? Well, a lot of people benefited. In my book, the people who benefited were arms manufacturers. They kind of set this whole thing up. That's the conspiracy, right? But in fact, the demise of the Plain Indians by the U.S. Army opened up all the land west of the Missouri River for homesteading and railroads and so on and so forth. That's just historically true.
I knew this is
my conspiratorial mind started going on that, and you know who benefited. So
you have a great mind.
The arms dealers, and they kind of manipulated this so Custer would die because they just wanted to see if they could maneuver public opinion, and they did. You know,
I never knew.
Just historically, I'm sorry to on, but I find this really fascinating. Custer's in 1876. Custer's troops have single-shot weapons, right? 22 years later, American battleships are in Manila Bay lobbing 5-inch shells into the Spanish fleet. 22 years later, I mean, I found that amazing that they had gone, that our arms had done this, and this was part of this is part of the story here, that the secret that, you know, and just 16 years later after our battleships were duking it out with the Spaniards in Manila Bay, you know, some crazy 19-year-old, kid that, shoots the Archduke Ferdinand. Mm-hmm. And that very and the world goes into that 17 million people died because some punk anarchist shoots the Archduke. How do you explain that? I mean, you explain it that everybody wanted war, man. That's how you explain it. They went after each other.
That's the start.
And the arms manufacturers in that war, by the way, the Krupp's arms manufacturers, this is a historical fact, they were selling to Vickers, which was the major English arms manufacturer. They were selling artillery fuses. Krupp's, the German manufacturer, was selling the English artillery fuses so that English artillery could kill German guys. I mean, it's just, and that went on for the first 2 years of the war.
Wow.
The arms dealers were non-political, even though they resided in the various countries. And that's not the only. Anyway, that's what I found fascinating, and that's what the secret is, and that's why Tom McGuire has a hard time unraveling all this, because people are now after him. That secret cannot come out about Custer.
That's a fascinating plot that you've developed there. One thing that just amazes me, I knew that, tragically, the U.S. Army had driven the Native Americans out of the land they promised them. I had no idea, I never put this two and two together, that Custer's last stand occurred just a few days before the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It was 1876. And because the country found out about Custer's death one day after the 4th of July, that's part of the reason why the reaction was so strong. I never knew that before. It's fascinating.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating story that, and just the coincidence that it was Custer who his column found the gold, which was the start of his death. I mean, or at least if he didn't get away and really died there, it all started with him in 1874 finding gold in the Black Hills.
Just as a matter of history, do you know, obviously it was several days later, 9 or 10 days, whatever, before the nation knew of his death. This was before CNN, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
But was there ever... was there a body? I mean, is there a Custer grave, or is that a mystery as well?
No, there is. That's the other thing about it. I tell you, there's kind of a war going on. It's a storm in social media, just my book, and I probably started it, and I didn't mean to, but, so there's pros and cons. People are castigating me for, how could you say that Custer, he was, that he didn't die there. There were witnesses. Well, the fact was that Custer, on June 25th, 1876, Custer and his command gets wiped out. Let's assume that Custer was one of them or not one of them. Doesn't make any difference, because the bodies, because there was a fight going on, it was 3 days before anybody got to those bodies. And by that time, flesh-eating crows had been there, animals had been there, and the Indians had desecrated the bodies so much. So what we're led to believe, and this is kind of my, again, a kind of conspiratorial view, is that Custer, the view is that Custer was, everybody else was mutilated, but they left Custer alone, and he was kind of sitting in a, laying on his horse with, kind of his arm holding his head. And I find that, I mean, again, if I was a conspiratorialist, I could say that's just all made up, his brother, Tom, was there 20 feet from him, and Tom Custer, who looked a lot like George Custer, Tom Custer, the only way that they could identify him was by a tattoo that he had on his right arm. He was so mutilated, as they all were, and so I'm saying Custer's bones, they left him, they supposedly put all these guys, they tried to build shallow graves for them, and they did, supposedly, and I'm not saying that's true, they did, covered them up, shallow graves, probably with an inch of dirt, and they didn't come back for a whole year.
Wow.
So by that time, all those bones were scattered all over the place. So they took Custer, they buried him in what they hoped was some of his bones anyway, back to Michigan, where he was from. They then took it to West Point, where I think supposedly his grave still is, though it could be at Arlington, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's empty. I don't mean that conspiratorially. It's just the way the times were,
Yeah.
and that's what happened there. Those guys.
Dennis, I got to tell you, you've got me on pins and needles here. I'm intrigued, damn it. I think our listeners are too. This is fascinating stuff. Listeners, here's the title of Dennis Koller's book, The Custer Conspiracy. The Custer Conspiracy. Has the truth been buried since 1876? If you're looking for Dennis Koller online, or his two previous books, his last name is spelled Koller. And The Custer Conspiracy, available generally everywhere we find books these days, Dennis?
You know, it is. It's mostly on Amazon. That's the easiest place to get it. It's a small press. It's not out of one of the 5 conglomerates in New York. So I'm independently published. You can go to any bookstore, yes, but you have to ask for it. They won't probably carry it, but you can get it. You can get it, and you can get it from me. I mean, I have my www.denniskoller.com, and you could buy it out of there, and I'll send it to you postage free, just like Amazon.
Did Custer die, the little big one, or didn't he?
Yeah.
Dennis, you got a great setup here for a super mystery. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today. Really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it very much. You're having me on, Dave. You take care.
You too, my friend. So long.
Bye-bye.